476 A.D. A teenage emperor sits in a palace that echoes with footsteps instead of orders. Outside, standards that once terrified continents sag in the wind above a city that has forgotten how to command. His name is Romulus Augustus, the last emperor in the West. And before the day is done, a commander named Odoacer will ask him to lay the diadem down. Most stories end here with a simple headline: Barbarians broke the gates, and Rome fell. But that explanation is comfortably wrong. Empires rarely die from a single blow. They bleed out from wounds they refuse to see. For centuries, Rome trained itself to endure, to pave mountains into roads, to bridge rivers with stone, to turn soldiers into citizens, and citizens into soldiers. Yet beneath the arches and triumphs, something slow and fatal spread. This film follows the truth behind the ending. We return to the hard virtues of the early republic, trace the brilliance of the Pax Romana, then watch the lights dim. We will see three fatal mistakes, hatched inside long before any siege tower rose outside the walls. First, politics turned predatory, and the state devoured itself in civil wars. Second, money thinned into fraud, and debts crushed the middle who once filled the legions. Third, the army forgot what language loyalty speaks, and the empire hired protection that came to own its protector. When Odoacer finally knocked, he found not a fortress, but a door already unlatched. Tonight, from 753 BC to 476, we will follow the breath of a civilization, steady, then ragged, then still, and ask a harder question. If Rome fell, where did the first stone come loose? Listen to the silence between drumbeats and cheers. In that hush, three wounds whisper their names, and history begins to tell the truth. Begin not with marble, but with a hillside of scrub and rumor. In 753 BC, so the story goes, twins named Romulus and Remus were cast upon a river, nursed by a she-wolf, and raised by a shepherd. The tale is half myth, half memory, yet it frames Rome's first conviction. Hardship could be turned into destiny. When the settlements on the Tiber pulled together, they chose a past that honored struggle and a future that promised order. History remembers a founder who slew his brother to defend a boundary. Romans remembered the vow to keep boundaries sacred. Through centuries of kings, Rome learned the choreography of power: auspices, priests, elite marriages, and borrowed tools. From Etruscans came bright insignia. From Latins and Sabines, a web of alliances that taught Rome to absorb outsiders without dissolving itself. In 509 BC, the monarchy ended, and an aristocratic republic took shape. At its heart stood the Senate, a council of elders whose counsel carried the gravity of generations. Assemblies of citizens voted on laws and magistrates, while elected consuls held imperium, the right to command. Underneath the offices lived mos maiorum, ancestral custom, not carved on a wall but recited at home. Gravitas, a weight of character; virtus, excellence proven in service; disciplina, appetite yoked to duty; pietas, loyalty to gods, family, and state. These habits turned farmers into soldiers, and, when the crisis ended, soldiers back into farmers. A citizen might leave his plow, take his place in the manipular line, then return to harvest with victory and ache. The law followed life. In the 5th century BC, the 12 tables fixed custom into writing so the humble could defend themselves against memory. Property, contract, and procedure became the arteries of a growing body. The tables did not erase inequality, yet they created a common script by which disputes could be judged and peace restored. Patronage, clientela, stitched classes together. The paterfamilias ruled the household. Censors graded citizens. Tribunes, sacrosanct, wielded a veto sharp enough to halt a consul. Friction, yes. Paralysis, no. Rome learned to quarrel without suicide. Distance became discipline. Roads first were beaten paths, then engineered lines. The Via Appia, begun in 312 BC, set a standard, straight as courage, crowned with stone, so legions could march where strategy required rather than where mud permitted. Aqueducts followed, blue rivers raised into arches so the city could drink and grow. Even the seams between stones taught a lesson. Fit parts tightly, and the whole will bear centuries. War was education. Against Latins and Samnites, Rome learned humiliation, adapted, and returned with a smarter bite. The manipular legion, flexible and stubborn, fought in 3 lines: hastati, principes, triarii, stepping into and out of danger like a living machine. Defeat taught reserves. Victory taught restraint. Allies were bound by treaties that granted partial citizenship, a promise of belonging without its full privileges. Hard and generous, the net widened with each campaign and came back stronger for the strain. Religion bound, time to place. Romans bargained with their gods through vows and sacrifices, piety that moved armies and raised temples. If omens were wrong, a campaign might wait. If a vow was fulfilled, a shrine rose. Festivals knitted memory to the present. The sacred and the ordinary shared a street. Stories condensed virtue into figures. Cincinnatus left his field to rescue the state and returned. Horatius kept a bridge while comrades broke it behind him. Cloelia swam the river to lead hostages home. Embellished or not, these scenes mattered because they matched behavior Romans prized. A young man heard them and learned that honor could be harvested like grain and squandered just as easily. By the 3rd century BC, Rome was no longer a city alone, but a system. Census rolls sorted men, assemblies tallied votes by tribe and century, magistrates climbed the cursus honorum, a ladder whose rungs were duty. The Republic could be cruel to the conquered, yet its cruelty followed rules that made negotiation possible. Mercy appeared often enough to make surrender rational. The seed of empire was present, but what sprouted first was habit. Summon allies, share spoils, settle veterans, plant a colony, build a road, move on. Stand on the Capitoline at dusk and the view explains the idea. Farms and villages bound to the city not by affection but by interest, contracts, protections, prospects. Rome asked people to keep a calendar, obey a summons, pay a levy, and in return offered security and chance. The arrangement would grow harsher as power grew. Yet here lived the muscle that lifted a continent. Ordinary lives directed toward a common horizon. Rome began as an argument that order could be taught and carried, that custom could grow into law, and that law, worn smooth by practice, could send men farther than their fathers dreamed. Begin with a winter footfall and a whisper that becomes a shout. In January of 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood at the Rubicon. Behind him, veterans who had bled in Gaul. Before him, a Senate that treated his triumphs as crimes. He crossed. Rome's laws did not shatter that night. They bent around a man who believed the Republic could no longer carry the weight of its victories. Civil war turned rituals into scenery for marching boots. Pompey the Great, once Caesar's ally and son-in-law, withdrew to the east to gather fleets and clients while Italy fell to Caesar's speed. At Pharsalus in 48 BC, dust and decision settled together. Caesar's thinner line, anchored by veterans, cut Pompey's larger army to pieces and sent its chief fleeing toward Egypt and an end behind palace walls. The Republic, fevered by rivalry, discovered how quickly a constitution can become an altar where the city sacrifices certainty for a commander. Yet Caesar did not live long enough to found an empire. He wore the laurel too visibly, piled offices like trophies, and alarmed aristocrats who heard monarchy in every cheer. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, knives flashed beneath the gaze of Pompey's statue, and the dictator who had remade politics fell at the base of his rival's stone. Those who struck for liberty learned another lesson. Once blood washes over a republic, it is hard to return to business as usual. Rome's streets filled with mourning and menace, and hope retreated into households where families spoke softly about tomorrow. Into that storm stepped a youth with an old name. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grand-nephew and adopted son, was 19 when he claimed the legacy. He did not look like a conqueror, but he sounded like continuity. Caesar's will made flesh, patient, legalistic, impossible to ignore. He bargained with Mark Antony, who had the legions, and with Lepidus, who had priestly prestige. Together they formed the Second Triumvirate, proscribed enemies with lists that turned property into funding and blood into policy, and hunted the assassins to the edges of the world. But alliances born of fear do not age well. The last contest unfolded on water and rumor. In 31 BC, near Actium, Octavian's admiral Agrippa pinned the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra against a coastline that turned into a trap. Sails caught a wind of fate. Cleopatra fled first, Antony followed, and Octavian took the victory not as a general drunk on triumph, but as a clerk who had finally balanced the accounts. He returned to Rome and, with exquisite theater, pretended to resign. The Senate, grateful and exhausted, handed authority back in a package labeled with modesty. In 27 BC, they called him Augustus, the revered one, and the empire learned to hide monarchy inside familiar shapes. Here began the long quiet called the Pax Romana, not a lullaby, but a firm hand. Augustus kept the outline of old offices, yet moved their center of gravity. He professionalized the legions, fixed terms and wages, and settled veterans on land so the sword could rest in a plow again. He created the Praetorian Guard to keep the heart steady, reformed taxation so provinces paid predictably, and divided provincial administration so the Senate could boast, while the princeps governed. Law was dusted, rituals rewritten, and the machine oiled until it hummed without fuss. Power softened its voice and multiplied its instruments. Governors were watched. Audits became a craft. The imperial post, the cursus publicus, stitched provinces to the capital with relays of fresh horses and stamped tablets that authorized speed. The more Rome conquered distance, the nearer it felt to itself. A letter could run from the Rhine to the Tiber with a tempo that turned borders into pages. Maps became plans. Plans became roads. Roads became habit. Engineering spoke as clearly as law. Stone arches taught gravity to carry water. Concrete let ambition ignore the old arguments between brick and beam. Aqueducts like the Aqua Virgo and Aqua Julia slipped into the city's bones. Bridges leaped rivers with a practiced grace. Harbors such as Portus, begun under Claudius and shaped by successors, gave ships a safe throat into which to pour Spain's oil, Egypt's grain, and Africa's garum. A city fed without panic could dream of poetry, and a garrison supplied without fear could march on a timetable instead of a prayer. Legions, once citizen farms in motion, settled into a professional rhythm. A standard legion fielded cohorts drilled to obey the same drum wherever the sun struck the eagle. Camp followed a geometry that made wilderness familiar. Ditch and rampart, gates aligned with cardinal points, tents pegged along streets that mirrored a small city complete with headquarters and shrine. In the morning, a soldier knew where to find his contubernarium. At night, he knew where to stake his pride. Uniformity turned strangers into a single instrument. The provinces learned how to live inside Rome without living in Rome. Local elites were courted and co-opted. City councils competed in generosity. Amphitheaters, baths, and forums rose as civic boasting made infrastructure a race. Latin and Greek braided through administration, and peoples who kept their own gods learned to speak the empire's measurements. To be Roman became an economy of trust, contracts enforced by predictable courts, coins whose faces promised redemption, punishments not arbitrary, but written. Not all of this came without bruises. Rebellions sparked along frontiers and in hearts. The Teutoburg Forest in AD 9 taught Augustus that the Rhine and Danube were not merely lines to be crossed at whim. 3 legions vanished in a green maw when Arminius turned alliance into ambush. Judea simmered and then exploded, a reminder that empire is not a synonym for consent. Yet Rome's response was methodical: punish, pacify, plant a camp, pave a road, and resume the drum. The sternness carried a bargain: protection in exchange for obedience. After Augustus, the machinery did not stall when hands changed. Tiberius governed by letter from Capri. Caligula turned the palace theatrical. Claudius, mocked for his limp and stammer, added Britain and ruled competently. Nero performed while the city burned by rumor or reality. In 69, the year of the 4 emperors showed that swords could count votes, until Vespasian steadied finance, began the great amphitheater, and restored discipline. Even in triumph, the lesson remained practical. The coin still mostly held its promise. Courts still kept their pace. The army still recruited men who believed the Roman future was theirs. The center might quiver when a mediocre princeps drifted, but the periphery held because routine held. Tax caravans met ships at harbors staffed by clerks who knew which seal opened which warehouse. In such details, dominion endured. What made Rome rise was not simply bravery or cruelty, but the decision to turn victory into structure. Standards were not only trophies, they were mnemonics for procedure. If a bridge worked across one river, build it across 3. If a law steadied one province, adapt it for 2. If a census sorted obligations, keep counting until counting itself became comfort. The Republic's old virtues, gravitas, virtus, and disciplina, put on new uniforms, but they still walk the same road. So when we speak of power, imagine not only legions on a ridge, but also a clerk in a shaded office copying figures that will decide where grain sails next month. Imagine surveyors in the noon glare mapping a colony by the scratch of a groma. Imagine a mason tapping an archstone until the fit makes a note only he can hear. Thousands of such acts, repeated without drama, lifted Rome higher than a general's shout ever could. Rise is a story of attention. Caesar seized it, Augustus held it, administrators preserved it, engineers embodied it. From the Rubicon to the Forum of Augustus, the city learned to make time its ally, borrowing from the future to stabilize the present and paying the debt with predictable taxes. The empire's lesson was simple. Permanence is a habit disguised as stone. It would last as long as people believed in the exchange, service for security, and pride for peace. And as long as the center convinced distant towns that Rome's promises would arrive with the post. In the next act, we will watch confidence harden into complacency and procedures turn into prisons. As the price of power comes due, begin with a morning in marble. The streets are swept before dawn. Shopkeepers lift their shutters to the clatter of iron rings. Water drops from aqueduct arches into basins where children chase reflections. Rome in the high empire wears its confidence like a cloak, practical, heavy, and warm. If the Republic taught the city how to endure, the empire under its best rulers taught it how to live well and long. After the storms that brought Augustus to power, a pattern emerged that looked like peace made permanent. The machinery of law and supply learned to run without a hero at the lever. Of the men who followed, some were mediocre, some ridiculous, and some, for a blessed span, were excellent. The period we call the Golden Age flowered most plainly under the emperors grouped as the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, with Lucius Verus briefly sharing the purple. Their reigns did not abolish misfortune, they organized it. Their success did not silence ambition, it taught ambition to file paperwork. Begin with Trajan. In AD 98, he inherited a state tuned by long habit and stretched it to its widest map. A soldier's emperor, he toured roads rather than palaces, tested bridges with his own weight, and spent treasure on monuments that doubled as memory. The conquest of Dacia across the Danube poured bullion into Roman ledgers. The arch and the column that celebrated those campaigns taught citizens to read the empire in stone. Spiral scenes climbed Trajan's column like a scroll unrolling in the open air. Marches, bridges, siege towers, a general addressing men, one cohort at a time. It is history told in scenes of work. Trajan looked east as well. His Parthian campaigns pushed Roman eagles toward Mesopotamia, and for a season, Armenia belonged to his itinerary rather than his imagination. Yet even his ambition met a governor wiser than glory. Distance. A river can be bridged for a day. A supply line must be bridged for a year. When he died in 117, he left a treasury that could still pay the armies and a successor who understood that borders, if placed wisely, are not defeats but decisions. Hadrian, his adopted heir, turned conquest into consolidation. In Britannia, he measured the island with a wall, a line of stone and turf that admitted movement only through gates where Rome did the counting. Hadrian's wall, begun around AD 122, was less a boast than an instrument. Forts at equal intervals, mile castles that beat time, ditches that forced approach into corridors, an officer could study from a tower. Across the empire, he traveled with a curiosity that felt like governance. Cities received patronage, laws received refinement, provinces received the message that the emperor knew their names. He loved architecture for what it could teach. The Pantheon's new dome, poured from concrete into a hemisphere that seems to rest on light, argues that materials obey when asked correctly. Vaults multiply, baths bloom. The line between comfort and grandeur blurs into a habit the Romans called order. Hadrian collected Greek art and ideas not as fragile treasures, but as tools. He Greeked the empire without un-Romaning it. Under Antoninus Pius, the empire discovered that the best reforms can be quiet. He ruled from 138 to 161 with a patience that felt like abundance. Legal rescripts softened edges. The harsh powers of the paterfamilias were checked by principle. Guardianship and inheritance became matters for jurists with long memories rather than magistrates with short tempers. In the provinces, governors learned that cruelty wasted taxes, and that efficient fairness collected more with fewer soldiers. If Trajan's virtue was expansion, and Hadrian's virtue was consolidation, Pius's virtue was continuity, the reassurance that tomorrow would look enough like today to make a promise worth keeping. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and emperor, inherited a world that was beginning to harden at the edges. The Marcomannic Wars pressed along the Danube. The Antonine Plague rode trade routes with the efficiency of logistics itself. Yet, even as he campaigned, Marcus wrote to himself about duty, humility, and the discipline of the mind. Imagine the emperor in a tent, a candle guttering while he copies thoughts he never meant for us to read. It belongs to this age's dignity. Power trying to be decent under pressure. He was no revolutionary. He did what the system asked. Keep the machine oiled and the borders manned, then asked himself to be better than the part he played. What did ordinary life feel like under such rulers? In cities, water ran as reliably as sunrise. Aqueducts like the Aqua Claudia and Anio Novus, completed under Claudius in AD 52, shouldered hills to pour clarity into cisterns and baths. Bathing was not luxury, but punctuation. Mornings or afternoons in warmth among friends and strangers, with rooms sequenced from tepid to hot, then cold, skin tingling, thoughts unknotted. The baths were schools of citizenship. People learned there to share space, to gossip, to argue, to forgive. The grain fleet from Egypt and North Africa moved on schedules that made hunger a memory rather than a forecast. Ostia and the newer harbor at Portus received hulls heavy with wheat. Granaries stacked the year into brick rooms. Bakers kneaded annona into loaves stamped for distribution. Bread and circuses is an easy phrase to sneer at, yet it names a policy that turned volatility into habit. Amphitheaters gave the crowd sight lines for drama and discipline. Theaters and forums gave them words. Entertainment regularized the chaos of appetite and gathered strangers into a civic we. Roads reached everywhere. The cursus publicus delivered an imperial order faster than rumor if weather behaved. Milestones were not merely measurements but reminders. Someone counted. Someone cared. Someone would punish the official who missed a report. At each mancio, a tired messenger could exchange a lathered horse for a fresh one, and with a stamped tablet, pass through the gate where a clerk wrote down the hour. The empire felt small because travel felt planned. Law matured into literature. Jurists like Gaius distilled practice into teaching. The edictal law of the praetors, pruned and systematized, gave litigants predictable paths through quarrels. In such a world, risk could be priced, investment imagined, partnership trusted. A fisherman on the Ebro could sell a catch to a syndicate that would ice it, cart it, pickle it, and serve it in Africa, all on contracts written in a hand, steady enough to be binding. Roman citizenship, expanded gradually and widely, meant something practical. A message to a magistrate would be read, and a verdict, however imperfect, would arrive. Religions braided without snapping the rope. Local gods kept their festivals. The imperial cult kept loyalty ceremonious. Mystery rites offered solace. Judaism and the growing movement of Christians found both friction and a kind of protection in the contradictions of Roman rule. The Golden Age did not erase difference. It stacked it into a mosaic. The census counted persons rather than tribes. Contracts bound interests rather than clans. Statues of emperors stood in forums as civic mirrors. Here is the shape of your obligations and the promise of your streets. Architecture dramatized confidence without shouting it. Forums in provincial capitals borrowed Rome's vocabulary. Basilicas for business, arches for memory, theaters for speech and song. A veteran settling in a colony might find a city that, though new to him, felt legible. Orthogonal streets, a central square, a temple facing a hall where magistrates wore the same stripe as in Italy. If empire is a language, architecture was its grammar. You could walk from Tarraco to Tarsus and read the same civic sentence. The army adjusted to prosperity. Peace in the interior let frontier units specialize. Legionary fortresses along the limes became small economies, their workshops producing tiles, boots, and tools stamped with abbreviations that make archaeologists smile today. Auxiliary cohorts, recruited from non-citizens, earned the franchise with service, weaving loyalty into the ranks. A soldier could send pay home knowing it would be received in a court that recognized his signature. Veterans received plots and a steady claim on gratitude baked into local maps. All this made Rome feel invincible because failure was no longer personal. It was systemic, and systems looked immortal. When a governor died, the province did not. When a ship sank, the granary dipped into reserve. When an emperor proved vain, a bureaucracy buffered his whims. The Golden Age was less a blaze than a well-lit room where everything had a place. If a beam cracked, a clerk recorded it. If a bridge swayed, an engineer measured the movement. The empire believed in feedback loops long before anyone named them. Even so, hairline fractures appeared. The cost of defending long borders rose with every cohort added to a frontier. Subsidies to client tribes hardened into permanent expectations. When drought kissed a harvest or a sickness traveled with victory, redundancy that felt like luxury became necessity. The Antonine Plague, from about 165, carried off multitudes, perhaps even co-emperor Lucius Verus, and forced recruitment to dig deeper, budgets to stretch thinner. Markets recovered, but they remembered. Still, compared to the storms to come, these were clouds, not night. The Golden Age's most important gift was not marble or literature, but habits. Maintenance scheduled rather than postponed. Taxes assessed by rule rather than whim. The feeling among ordinary people that tomorrow would look enough like today to justify a promise. A shopkeeper could apprentice a son. A farmer could plant an olive that would fruit for his granddaughter. A builder could lay foundations without betting against a riot. Why did Rome seem invincible? Because the empire had made entropy its opponent, and for a long while, won. Grain moved as if by calendar, not chance. Legions rotated duty like clockwork. Letters traveled like swallows. The culture rewarded moderation in its best days and absorbed excess in its worst. Even emperors, crowned by chance, learned to act as caretakers rather than authors. The average citizen's life did not require genius to stay afloat. Competence, multiplied across millions of errands completed and forms filed, felt like fate. Stand again in that morning light and watch how the city breathes. A notary opens his wax tablets. A midwife ties a ribbon. In a school, a boy recites a line of Virgil and stumbles only once. In the forum, a bronze statue gleams, newly polished by a guild proud of its contract. A soldier on leave counts the days until he must march north, and the baker, hearing a ship's bell on the river, knows his flour will be priced like yesterday's. This is what invincibility feels like. Not an army on parade, but 1,000 small expectations met on time. In the next act, this confidence will become a liability. The loops that kept the system steady will be strained by shocks they were not built to absorb. Politics will turn from stitching to tearing, money from promise to pretense, and the army from shield to marketplace. For now, remember the sound of orderly water falling into a stone basin. It is the sound an empire makes when it believes it will last forever. The Golden Age taught Rome to trust routines. The next century taught her what happens when routines are tested to destruction. If an empire is a vast agreement, pay, serve, obey, and in return receive order, justice, and defense, then the breach of that agreement begins inside. Our 3 wounds opened at different speeds, but they bled into each other until the body could not tell which hurt first. Begin with politics turning predatory. In AD 193, after Commodus fell and Pertinax was cut down for reforming too quickly, the Praetorian Guard, invented to protect the princeps, auctioned the empire like a seized estate. Didius Julianus bought a throne he could not keep, and the provinces answered with the only ballot they trusted: legions. Septimius Severus marched, won, and told the soldiers to take their due. His advice to his sons, enrich the troops and despise the rest, was less a quip than a weather report. The Guard's disgrace was a preface. When the century turned toward storm, the habit of power changed. Emperors would be made where the army camped and killed where the army doubted. In 235, the crisis of the 3rd century began with a murder near the Rhine. Alexander Severus, cautious and unpopular, died under the hands of men he paid, and Maximinus Thrax, a giant of talent and suspicion, ruled from the saddle. What followed was not a sequence, but a shudder. Usurpers rising in garrisons, emperors counted in months, not years, coins struck with new faces before the old could tarnish. The frontier burned in fragments, Sarmatians and Goths pressing along the Danube, new Persian kings under Ardashir and Shapur, testing Rome's eastern sinews, and the interior learned to live with civil war as if it were weather. Legitimacy, the empire's invisible architecture, came apart. The Senate's imprimatur mattered less than a cohort's applause. Provinces, hearing distant thunder, raised their own umbrellas. In Gaul, Postumus built a breakaway empire that collected taxes, defended borders, and stamped coins with a confidence the center could not match. In the east, the city of Palmyra under Odaenathus and the formidable Zenobia turned necessity into policy, fielding armies that fought Persia and governed provinces while Rome bled. Aurelian, a soldier of iron, would later stitch these pieces back, but by then, the garment showed seams. Political violence ate the state's memory. When an emperor lived a year, he barely learned the names of his secretaries. When he died, the next man began again with punishments and pardons. A bureaucracy designed to carry continuity across reigns became an engine for purges, and the habit of replacing trusted men with loyal ones made loyal men scarce. Each new Augustus needed coin to pay the army that had made him. Each issuance needed metal. Each shipment to the mints needed consent from regions that no longer felt bound by yesterday's favors. Governing turned into juggling, and beside every ball was a knife. Now watch the second wound. Money, open wider under the first. The denarius had once been a promise sung in silver. Over time, pressure turned promise into pretense. Caracalla, seeking to pay more men without obvious tax pain, introduced the Antoninianus around AD 215, a coin which pretended to be worth 2 denarii while holding less than 1.5 in silver. By the mid-3rd century, scarcity and fear shaved every issue thinner. A coin that left the mint with a blanching of silver looked respectable for a week, and then, in the hand's honest friction, revealed its bronze heart. Markets learned to price not faces, but metal. Salaries multiplied in numerals while shrinking in worth. The soldier at the gate demanded more and trusted less. Inflation did not arrive like a shout. It rustled, then hissed. Paymasters pushed chests across courtyards, sweating under loads that bought less. Traders wrote 2 prices on the same jar, one for rumor and one for reality. The state, desperate for grain and boots for armies that had split into smaller, more mobile units, demanded taxes in kind: sacks of wheat, hides, oil, wine, carts, even labor, as a nona militaris turned the countryside into a supply chain with no invoice. Curiales, local aristocrats once proud to fund festivals, found their municipal duties hardening into shackles. When wealth is conscripted without honor, generosity migrates. Diocletian, the reformer who would close the crisis in 284, saw the numbers as a disease of trust. 2 decades after he took power, he issued the Price Edict of 301, a long stone command meant to nail costs to the earth. So much for wheat, so much for shoes, so much for a mule or a day's work. He hoped to make fairness audible. Black markets made mockery instead. Merchants hid stock. Soldiers tried to enforce. People learned again the oldest lesson in economics. If the coin lies, the world finds a truth of its own. Yet Diocletian's instinct was not madness. It was diagnosis. The empire had become too complex, too hungry for metal, too divided by patrols and sieges, to be fed by yesterday's rules. The plagues struck between these shocks like hammers on already cracked stone. The Antonine plague, beginning around 165, and the later plague of Cyprian, around 249, moved along roads and sea lanes Rome had built in triumph. Markets emptied not by price, but by funerals. Recruitment tables faced boys with the eyes of men. Farms missed a harvest and then missed a generation. Every deficit asked the treasury for relief. Every relief minted more lies. What had been a calendar of abundance turned into a schedule of substitutions. At the frontier, a centurion greeted a recruit who had never held a plow. At the forum, a magistrate heard petitions that smelled of hunger. The third wound ran along the borders and through the camps. Rome's army had once been a mirror in which citizens saw themselves with cleaner armor. Now, defending long frontiers against more organized enemies, it needed men the farms no longer supplied. Recruitment shortfalls invited improvisation. Allies and subjects with good cavalry were hired. Tribal groups were settled on lands inside the empire under treaties that promised service for security. The word foederati, federates, named a bargain that turned strangers into shields. Done well, it saved provinces. Done often, it changed the army's language and loyalties. The hinges creaked in 378 at Adrianople. Goths, pushed by Huns and mishandled by Roman officials who sold them dog meat and insult as they crossed the Danube under treaty, revolted. Emperor Valens, eager and proud, marched without waiting for his western colleague Gratian, misread the field, and found himself and much of his comitatenses, the central field army, surrounded by skilled horse and stubborn foot. The battle became a furnace. The emperor died in the blaze or its aftermath, and the empire learned that even a professional army can be fed its own discipline when numbers, terrain, and leadership misalign. Theodosius, who took the purple after, made peace and settled Goths as federates in 382, a pragmatic repair that left the policy's paradox exposed. An enemy becomes an ally on paper and remains a nation under arms in practice. Foederati service was not simple hire. These were communities led by kings who owed loyalty to their own dead as much as to an emperor in a distant mosaic. They fought well for Rome when paid and honored. They negotiated hard when hungry or slighted. They learned the empire's strengths and its rhythms. In the next generation, Alaric, a Gothic leader who had served in Roman campaigns and felt under-rewarded, would use negotiation like a ram. He wanted position, pay, and respect for his people inside the system. When denied, he took it outside, marching into Italy, threatening, withdrawing, returning. The sack of 410 was less a conquest than a verdict. The city, that had not seen an enemy inside its walls for 8 centuries, heard barbarian boots in its streets, and realized that metaphors become maps. Meanwhile, at the western edges of the Mediterranean, the Vandals crossed into Africa in 429 under their king Geyseris, and with astonishing speed took the grain basket Rome could least afford to lose. Naval power, once asserted from harbors built in calmer days, sputtered. Subsidies that had bought peace became tribute that bought respite. The army still fought, but its pieces felt borrowed. Limitanae, the border troops, became farmers with spears. Comitatenses, the mobile field armies, answered crises but arrived late and thin. Generals stitched forces from Federate contingents, court guards, and whatever could be levied from cities that had learned to mistrust promises. The three wounds worsened each other. Political churn turned generals into politicians, and politicians into fugitives. So reforms that might have steadied recruitment or mended coinage died with their authors. Fiscal panic drove tax in kind and requisition that alienated the very farmers whose sons the legions needed, while price controls and suspicion of trade starved garrisons of quality goods. Military dependence on allied peoples, wise as triage, became dangerous as default. A Rome accustomed to obedience had to practice persuasion with leaders who could count the empire's options on their fingers and see the tremor. Yet even in crisis, competence flared. Gallienus, ruling amid the whirl, forbade senators from field command, a rude cut that professionalized the army, promoted cavalry, and created a mobile reserve that future emperors would refine. Aurelian, the restorer of the world, recaptured the breakaway empires, beat back Goths, abandoned Dacia to draw a defensible line, and girdled Rome in new walls whose brick still stands, proof that even panic can pour a foundation. Diocletian, climbing from obscure origins, ended the age of soldier roulette by imagining the Tetrarchy, two senior emperors called Augusti and two juniors called Caesares, spreading authority across space so no frontier would wait on a single man's travel time. He reformed taxes, tied assessments to a census that counted land and obligation, and tried to define prices so a boot would be a boot in every market. He even abdicated, teaching a lesson about limits that few successors learned to imitate. But the cost of stabilization was structure that bent personal freedom. As coin lies multiplied, taxes in kind became the empire's diet. To guarantee supply, people were bound to rolls. The colonus, a tenant farmer, found his status sliding toward serfdom. The curial, local notable, discovered that municipal office was a lifelong draft. Sons inherited professions not by desire, but by decree. Security at scale demanded predictability, and predictability jailed the flexibility that had once made Rome resilient. The empire survived the 3rd century in part by turning from a republic's negotiated responsibilities into a state's assigned duties. The bill would be paid in loyalty. By the time Theodosius died in 395, having made Christianity the empire's officially favored faith and briefly reunited the eastern and western halves under his will, the western court in Ravenna and the eastern in Constantinople shared a language and a law but faced different horizons. The east, richer in cities and compact in defensible geography, engineered diplomacy with Persian kings and kept fleets in seas it could still master. The west, stretched along a long frontier that invited raids as much as trade, leaned harder on Federate bargains. The three mistakes, predatory politics, broken money, and a hired shield, had not destroyed Rome. They had rewritten the manual. When the next generation negotiated with men like Alaric, the empire dealt with a mirror that talked back. So the diagnosis hardens. Political corruption and civil war, beginning as the Guards' impudence, swelling into emperor churn and provincial breakaways, shattered legitimacy and burned gold by the wagon. Economic collapse and currency debasement, minted in fear, enforced by edict, collected in kind, eroded trust and turned citizenship into an inventory. Military weakness, not of courage but of cohesion, replaced a citizen shield with a patchwork of Federate spears whose points sometimes faced inward. Each wound made treatment of the others harder. You cannot pay soldiers with clipped promises. You cannot rebuild coinage while every frontier begs for more men. You cannot steady politics while armies vote with swords. And yet, at every turn, remember the ghost of Rome's earlier strengths. The roads still ran. The baths still steamed. Jurists still wrote opinions in clean Latin. A centurion still barked an order and a line still formed. The empire did not die because its people forgot how to live. It died because the scale of its agreements outgrew the tools it had to keep them. When barbarians pushed, they pressed on an arch whose keystone had already shifted. When a treasurer reached for a solution, he found last year's patch and this year's hole. When a general looked over his shoulder for reserves, he saw men who spoke his words with an accent, and sometimes followed another king at night. The end was not a cliff, but a slope, and men walked it with the dignity habit grants. A clerk still sealed a letter, a baker still scored a loaf, a bishop still preached comfort, a soldier still oiled a cuirass. But above them, decisions were being made under duress, and the costs trickled down like winter through a cracked roof. The three mistakes, born of human impulses, fear for power, fear of shortage, fear of invasion, are not unique to Rome. What made them fatal was the empire's success at delaying their consequences until delay itself became the greatest risk. The night before a city falls is filled with ordinary sleep. When Theodosius died in 395, the Roman world was split not by idea, but by inheritance. Two courts, Arcadius in Constantinople, Honorius in Ravenna, shared a seal and a creed, but not a center of gravity. The East, compact and rich in cities, could tax traders as surely as fields. The West, wider and poorer, guarded a frontier that asked for men it could no longer raise. Into that imbalance walked men who had learned Rome's drill under other banners. Alaric had fought for the empire and expected to be paid in dignity as well as coin. Denied high command, he gathered Goths hardened by hunger and broken promises and moved with a negotiator's patience and a raider's speed. Stilicho, the Vandal-born general who kept Honorius's throne standing, parried him, bribed him, and twice saved Italy, in 402 at Pollentia and again near Verona. But politics choose heroes. Court intrigue strangled Stilicho in 408. Soldiers murdered his Federate families, and a door that had been held shut by one man's judgment swung open. Alaric returned. In 408 and 409, he ringed Rome and bargained. In 410, for 3 days, his warriors poured through a gate opened by desperation. The sack shocked the world less for its fires than its symbolism. For 8 centuries, no enemy had entered the city that taught others what a city was. Churches sheltered lives, senators ransomed neighbors, slaves guided plunderers through houses whose owners had once governed provinces by letter. The empire survived the humiliation, but something intimate broke. A dream woke up to find its walls were only walls. The West still had soldiers and statesmen. Aetius, lion of the late empire, balanced Huns, Goths, and Romans with the elegance of a juggler who counts with both hands and eyes. In 451 at the Catalonian plains, his coalition checked Attila, proving that Federate spears could still be aimed for Rome when Rome's interest aligned with their own. But the year after, the Emperor Valentinian III, panicked by influence he could neither measure nor master, killed Aetius in a fit of court arithmetic. A secretary offered the verdict, history remembers: you have cut off your right hand with your left. Africa, the West's lunch and ledger, was already gone. In 429, the Vandals under Gaiseric crossed from Spain. By 439, they held Carthage. Grain that once poured into Rome now filled other accounts, and a fleet that might have been decisive a century earlier became an expense in an age that counted copper, not silver. In 455, the Vandals sacked Rome by treaty and timetable, a plunder more measured than legend, but just as wounding. When revenue vanishes, virtue must balance books it did not write. The West defaulted not in law, but in logistics. Between catastrophes, flashes of competence. Majorian, briefly emperor from 457 to 461, tried to mend coin, discipline, and courage. His shipyards burned in a surprise attack. His reforms died with him. Ricimer, kingmaker without a crown, raised and erased emperors according to a calculus that summed power as proximity, not policy. Provinces answered as they always had when the center stuttered, with improvisation. In Gaul, Aegidius and then Syagrius held a Roman enclave by habit and pride. In Britain, soldiers settled and watched the imperial post stop visiting. In Spain, Sueves and Visigoths wrote their charters in Latin and their futures in local ink. Meanwhile, the East endured and evolved. Constantinople's walls, stone, brick, and genius, stood against Huns, Goths, and earthquakes alike. Bureaucrats learned to manage foederates with annuities and titles. Taxmen learned to farm revenue from merchants who never left the city. The West looked across the Adriatic at a mirror that refused sympathy. Zeno, emperor in the East, accepted the inevitable as policy. In 476, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the boy Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, he did not unmake Rome. He confessed a fact. The Senate, what was left of it, wrote a letter that sounded like a sigh. One emperor is enough. Yet even endings have prologues. Odoacer ruled Italy as king and client until Theodoric, leader of the Ostrogoths, crossed the Alps with Eastern blessing and two agendas: find land for his people and quiet a neighbor. In 493, he killed Odoacer at a banquet and governed from Ravenna in a Roman key. Consuls kept their year, laws kept their Latin, and a people who had once called themselves the world learned to call themselves Italians. The empire as a legal memory persisted in charters, in bishops' courts, in the stubborn routines of city life. What failed was not courage, but glue. The Western state could no longer guarantee the exchanges that made citizenship beat: tax for protection, labor for law, service for status. Armies asked for pay that treasuries could not provide. Treasuries demanded levies that farms could not spare. Farms yielded sons to kings who promised local safety over distant honor. These choices were rational. That is why they were fatal. The arch had carried too much weight for too long. When the keystone shifted, each block sought the ground on its own. Imagine at the end a notary closing a chest of wax tablets in a town no longer visited by inspectors. He writes the date according to consuls who will never serve, seals a deed with a stamp that once meant the world, and goes home by a road still straight, but already narrowing under weeds. A soldier on half-pay sharpens a broken spear and teaches his child a Latin prayer. A bishop preaches that the city of God cannot be sacked. They are all right in their way. The Rome that fell in 476 was a government, not a gravity. Its habits would linger wherever law still pretended to be a promise. The East would call itself Roman for 1,000 more years. The West, having lost the word, kept the sentences. Rome fell, and yet Rome endured in everything that could be carried by mind and hand. Its law, refined across centuries of cases and edicts, outlived the institutions that wrote it. In the East, Justinian's jurists would gather those precedents into the Corpus Juris Civilis, a library of reason that would later tutor Europe's courts and universities. The Latin Rome left behind softened into daughter languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, while Latin itself remained the Church's ledger and Europe's science for a millennium. Architecture kept teaching when emperors stopped. The arch and vault, concrete and brick, the grammar of basilica and forum, all were copied, adapted, and dreamed upon. Roads that once served legions now served merchants and monks. Milestones became medieval rumors of distance. Bridges kept markets honest. The calendar kept its months. The week kept its rhythm. The hours kept their Roman names whispered through monasteries. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, became the empire's most enduring institution, translating Roman administration into diocese and parish, making bishops local magistrates of mercy. The idea of citizenship changed address rather than meaning. To belong was to be counted, taught, and judged. Even the memory of the state lingered as ambition. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800, the Holy Roman Empire's long confused existence, the codes of Napoleon, the marble of capitals across the Atlantic, all confessed an inheritance. Rome's caution remains, too. Wealth without trust becomes weight. Armies without allegiance become markets. Politics without legitimacy becomes a stage where the guard sells seats. Barbarians did not end Rome. Rome ended Rome by forgetting the virtues that once turned habit into strength. That is a legacy worth studying, because it is never safely passed. If this journey helped you see the empire's fall not as a single night, but as a long reckoning, stay with us. Next week, we cross east to the Ottoman Empire, from a frontier beylik to a world power, through siege guns at 1453 and the long unraveling into modernity. We'll follow sultans and janissaries, scholars and sailors, and ask the same hard questions. What habits build a state, and which tempt it to trade vigor for comfort? Subscribe so you don't miss it. Every Sunday, we release a 45 to 60-minute documentary designed for deep learning and calm listening, clear narration, rich maps, clean timelines, and pacing gentle enough for night viewing. If you prefer the longer drift, watch for our occasional History for Sleep editions, where the story flows with fewer cuts and a quieter score. Tell us what surprised you most about Rome's fall. Was it Adrianople and the lesson of misjudged allies? The quiet violence of currency that lied? The way a single assassination could break a century's defense? And which corner of the Ottoman story should we open first? Osman's rise, Suleiman's law, or the empires that pushed back? Before you go, add this film to your Complete Empire Documentaries playlist and share it with someone who loves maps and long stories. Empires do not last forever, but good questions do. We'll keep asking them, together, week after week.